The Book of Enoch depicts human creation differently from what was preserved in the canon. This portrayal was considered too dangerous to remain. What was censored was not myth, it was interpretation. For centuries, this text circulated among Jewish communities of the Second Temple, was read by scribes, copied at Qumran, and quoted in early Christian circles. Then it disappeared. Not by accident, not because of irrelevance, but because it presented a version of human origin that challenged the narrative control of emerging religious institutions. The problem was never the existence of extraordinary creatures or supernatural events. The problem was the way humankind was portrayed, too conscious, too early, without proper moral preparation. If you seek understanding, and not filtered versions, continue. When we talk about censorship in ancient texts, we're not talking about public burnings or imperial decrees. Censorship worked in a more subtle and effective way, through exclusion. The process of forming the biblical canon, both Jewish and Christian, was long, political, and profoundly selective. Religious communities, rabbinical leaders, and Christian bishops made decisions about which texts represented divine authority and which should remain outside the norm. These decisions were not only theological, they were also strategic. Texts that complicated doctrine, offered alternative interpretations of human nature, or granted interpretive power outside established hierarchies were systematically excluded. The Book of Enoch was among them. Not because it was false, but because it was inconvenient. It preserved a parallel tradition, an alternative memory of how humanity acquired consciousness, knowledge, and responsibility. And this memory did not favor the narrative of control that institutions needed to maintain. The exclusion of a text does not mean its destruction. The Book of Enoch continued to exist in Ethiopian communities, where it was preserved in its entirety and considered sacred scripture to this day. In the West, fragments in Greek and Aramaic were found among the Dead Sea Scrolls, proving that it circulated widely among the Essenes and other Jewish sects in the centuries before the Common Era. These fragments confirm the antiquity of the text and its relevance to understanding Second Temple Judaism. But the Christian West and Rabbinic Judaism chose to ignore it. This choice was not neutral. It reflected a conscious decision to narrow the narrative, to simplify the cosmology, to reduce the complexity of human origins to a more controllable formula. Knowledge was never destroyed, it was controlled. Enoch is an enigmatic figure in the biblical text. Genesis dedicates only a few verses to him. He lived 365 years, walked with God, and did not die because God took him. This brevity contrasts with the narrative length dedicated to other patriarchs. But this lack of detail is significant. Enoch had no recorded problematic descendants, committed no visible errors, built no altars or cities. He simply walked with God and was taken. This image of ascension without death has fueled centuries of speculation. What did Enoch see? What did he learn? Why was he chosen to transcend mortality? The Book of Enoch answers these questions extensively and unsettlingly. It states that Enoch was taken to heaven to witness the secrets of creation, the mechanisms of the cosmos, the workings of divine justice, and, most importantly, the moment when humanity received knowledge before it was ready for it. This testimony is not mythological in the sense of fabulous. It is mythological in the sense of foundational. It organizes the collective memory of a critical moment, when human consciousness awoke abruptly and chaotically. Ethiopian tradition preserved the complete text in Ge'ez, the liturgical language of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church. While the West forgot Enoch, Ethiopia kept him alive. When European travelers began bringing back copies of the text in the 18th century, the academic reaction was one of skepticism. How could such an ancient text have survived only in Ethiopia? But the Dead Sea Scrolls, discovered in 1947, confirmed everything. Aramaic fragments of various sections of the Book of Enoch were found in Qumran, dating from the 3rd century BCE. This proved that the text was not a late invention, but an ancient Jewish work, widely read and respected. The Qumran community, likely linked to the Essenes, considered Enoch an authority. They copied, studied, and quoted the text as scripture. This means that, by the time of Jesus, the Book of Enoch circulated as sacred literature among significant Jewish groups. Its subsequent disappearance was not natural. It was the result of deliberate filtering. Now we come to the core. What does the Book of Enoch say about human creation that has been considered so problematic? The answer lies in how it portrays the origin of consciousness. Genesis offers an economical description. God forms humankind from the dust of the earth and breathes into them the breath of life. This image is powerful and sufficient for many theological purposes. But Enoch expands this narrative in a disturbing way. He presents humanity not only as divine creation, but as a design with a specific function. Human beings were made to inhabit the earth, multiply, and care for creation. But something happened that altered this plan. Something was introduced into human experience that was not foreseen: premature knowledge. Enoch describes the Watchers, celestial beings tasked with observing humanity without interfering. But they did interfere. They descended, had relationships with human women, and imparted knowledge that humanity was not prepared to receive. This is not just a story about sexual transgression. It is a narrative about the transfer of knowledge. The Watchers taught metallurgy, astronomy, medicine, cosmetics, sorcery, warfare. They revealed secrets of the cosmos that should have remained hidden until humanity developed the moral maturity to handle them. The result was chaos. Human consciousness expanded explosively, but without the wisdom necessary to use that knowledge responsibly. That is the key. The problem was never knowledge itself. The problem was the timing. Humanity gained power without ethics, understanding without compassion, technology without purpose, and the world plunged into violence. Stay until the end. This is deeper than it seems. The Book of Enoch doesn't condemn knowledge. It condemns irresponsible access to knowledge. It preserves the memory of a moment when humanity took a cognitive leap without being internally prepared. And this memory was censored because it questions the very narrative of religious control. If humanity was harmed by premature knowledge, who should control access to knowledge? Religious institutions. That's the implicit logic. But the Book of Enoch also suggests something more radical: that human consciousness is the result of an intervention, a breach of cosmic protocol. This shifts the human being from a position of obedient creature to a position of problematic heir to divine knowledge. This ambiguity is intolerable for any system that needs clear narratives about guilt, obedience, and salvation. Few realize this, but the Book of Enoch does not contradict Genesis. It expands upon it. Genesis speaks of the breath of life. Enoch speaks of the awakening of consciousness. Genesis briefly mentions the sons of God who had relations with the daughters of men. Enoch dedicates entire chapters to this event, detailing names, teachings, and consequences. Genesis says that human wickedness grew on earth. Enoch explains how, through the transmission of knowledge that accelerated technological and military development without corresponding ethical development. This difference is not contradictory. It is complementary. But it makes the narrative more complex, more unsettling, less controllable. And that is why it was excluded. The Book of Jubilees, another ancient text preserved at Qumran and in Ethiopian tradition, follows the same line. It reaffirms that the Watchers transgressed by teaching forbidden knowledge. It describes the flood as a divine response to the corruption caused by this knowledge. It insists that cosmic order demands limits between heaven and earth, between divine knowledge and human capacity. The Dead Sea Scrolls contain other texts that explore this same theme. The fragmentary Book of Giants narrates the consequences of the union between the Watchers and humans. These texts form a coherent corpus, a tradition that circulated widely in Second Temple Judaism. This tradition was deliberately marginalized after the destruction of the Temple in 70 CE, when Rabbinic Judaism consolidated the canon and excluded apocalyptic texts that complicated the doctrine. Early Christianity also knew and quoted the Book of Enoch. The Epistle of Jude, included in the New Testament, directly quotes a prophecy of Enoch. This means that, in the first century, Enoch was considered a prophetic authority by some Christian communities. But as Christianity became institutionalized, especially after the Council of Nicaea and subsequent councils, texts like Enoch were considered problematic. They offered an overly complex cosmology, an overly detailed angelology, a view of the origin of evil that complicated the doctrine of original sin. It was simpler, more manageable, more pastorally useful to focus on Genesis and leave Enoch aside. And that is what happened. The Gnostic Gospels discovered at Nag Hammadi present a different but related perspective. They emphasize knowledge as the path to salvation. For the Gnostics, the problem was not having knowledge, but being imprisoned in matter, without knowledge of one's own divine origin. This view partially inverts the narrative of Enoch, but maintains the core. Knowledge is central to human experience. The difference is that the Gnostics value knowledge as liberating, while Enoch portrays it as dangerous when misused. But both agree the human being is defined by their relationship with knowledge, and both were censored. Save this part for the end. The texts don't contradict each other. They reveal different levels of the same origin. Genesis presents the public, simplified narrative, suitable for liturgical reading and basic moral instruction. Enoch presents the esoteric, complex narrative, intended for those seeking to understand the profound mechanisms of creation and the fall. Both are true within their contexts, but only one was considered safe for general consumption. The other was reserved for restricted circles and eventually excluded. The unsettling escalation begins when we realize that this is not just an old issue. The pattern described in Enoch repeats itself. Humanity continues to acquire knowledge without developing corresponding moral wisdom. The Watcher's metallurgy today is nuclear physics. Astronomy is space exploration. Medicine is genetic engineering. Witchcraft is artificial intelligence. In each case, knowledge advances faster than ethics. In each case, power increases without a corresponding increase in responsibility. And in each case, there are voices warning of the dangers. But these voices are marginalized, ignored, or ridiculed, just as the Book of Enoch was marginalized. Knowledge has always demanded limits. Every wisdom tradition, from Solomon to Confucius, emphasizes that wisdom is not merely the accumulation of information, but discernment about when and how to use that information. The Book of Proverbs, included in the canon, dedicates chapters to the importance of timing, prudence, and proper retention. But Enoch goes further. He suggests that there is knowledge that should not be sought, secrets that should not be revealed, boundaries that should not be crossed. And he presents the story of the Watchers as a warning. Crossing these boundaries results in cosmic collapse. The transgression was intellectual and moral. The Watchers didn't just teach, they seduced. They offered power, beauty, dominion. They promised that knowledge would liberate humanity, making humans like gods. This promise is the same as the serpents in Eden. You will know good and evil. You will be like God. But Enoch reveals the cost of this promise. Yes, humanity gained knowledge, but it lost innocence, harmony, balance, and the world became filled with violence. This detail changes everything, because it means that the problem is not ignorance, it is knowledge without love, without compassion, without a higher purpose. Judgment arises when boundaries are broken. In the book of Enoch, the flood is not an arbitrary punishment, it is a necessary consequence. When cosmic order is violated, when the boundaries between heaven and earth are dissolved, when celestial beings mingle with humans and transmit forbidden secrets, the world becomes unsustainable. The flood is a reset. It is cleansing. It is restoration of order. But it is not a permanent solution. Because human consciousness, once awakened, does not return to its previous state. Post-Diluvian humanity still bears the mark of this knowledge. It still has the capacity to cross boundaries. It still faces the temptation to seek power without responsibility. This pattern repeats itself from Enoch to Revelation. The book of Daniel describes empires that rise and fall, kings who seek knowledge of the gods and are destroyed by their arrogance. The Revelation of John describes a beast that demands worship, a false prophet who performs signs, a system that concentrates power and control. In each case, the narrative is the same. An excess of knowledge and power in the wrong hands results in catastrophe. And in each case, there is a promise of judgment and restoration. But restoration is never a simple return to the past. It is painful transformation. Something was preserved outside the canon. Something was repeated in different cultures. Something always warned against the excess of knowledge. The myth of Prometheus, in the Greek tradition, narrates how the Titan stole fire from the gods and gave it to humans. This gift brought civilization, but also punishment. Prometheus was chained and tortured. Humanity gained power, but lost the simplicity of the Golden Age. This narrative parallels Enoch, not because the Greeks copied the Hebrews or vice versa, but because both preserve the memory of a critical moment in the evolution of human consciousness, a moment when knowledge was acquired abruptly and transformatively. Sumerian and Mesopotamian myths also contain this memory. The Epic of Gilgamesh narrates the quest for immortality and knowledge, but ends with the acceptance of mortality. Enkidu, raised by the gods as a wild man, is civilized through knowledge and sexuality, but this civilization also condemns him to death. Again, the pattern. Knowledge brings power and awareness, but also loss and mortality. The Sumerian tablets describe the Anunnaki, celestial beings who descended and interacted with humans, teaching arts and sciences. The similarity to the Watchers of Enoch is striking, not because one text copied the other, but because both preserve very ancient oral traditions about a foundational moment of civilization. The next passage connects everything and is almost never addressed. The true depth of the Book of Enoch lies not in the details about angels or giants. It lies in the description of human consciousness as something unstable, dangerous, requiring constant restraint and guidance. Enoch doesn't just narrate the past. He offers a diagnosis of human nature. And this diagnosis is disturbing because it suggests that humanity carries a permanent mark of transgression. Not sexual or ritual transgression, but epistemological transgression. Humanity knows things it shouldn't know. It has access to knowledge that exceeds its moral capacity. And this condition is irreversible. Here's the final connection. The ancient fear wasn't physical destruction. It was moral and spiritual destruction. It was the collapse of order, the dissolution of boundaries, the loss of purpose. And that fear remains relevant. We live in an age of unrestricted access to information. Anyone with an internet connection can learn to manufacture explosives, manipulate genomes, hack systems, spread disinformation. Knowledge that was once reserved for priests, scribes, and specialists is now available to everyone. But wisdom has not been democratized. Ethics have not been universalized. Responsibility has not been distributed, and the result is chaos, not apocalyptic chaos, but gradual chaos, erosion of trust, social fragmentation, extreme polarization, the use of technology for control and manipulation. Consciousness grows faster than moral wisdom. That is Enoch's diagnosis. And that is the problem of the contemporary world. We have the capacity to modify human genomes, but we lack consensus on when and how to do so. We have artificial intelligence capable of generating text, images, and videos indistinguishable from human content. But we lack ethical frameworks to regulate its use. We have nuclear weapons capable of extinguishing civilization, but we lack global governance capable of ensuring they are never used. In each case, technical knowledge has exceeded moral capacity. And in each case, we are repeating the pattern described in Enoch. The collapse begins when consciousness expands without limit or direction, when knowledge is treated as an end in itself, not as a means for human flourishing, when technique replaces wisdom, when power becomes the only value. Enoch preserved this warning. He described an era before the flood in which humanity possessed advanced knowledge, metallurgy, astronomy, medicine, but used this knowledge for war, oppression, and self-destruction. And he suggested that this era ended in catastrophe, not because God was arbitrary, but because the cosmic order does not tolerate indefinite imbalance. The most disturbing part of the book of Enoch is the description of judgment. Not the final eschatological judgment, but the ongoing judgment. Enoch sees the watchers being imprisoned, but not destroyed. They remain conscious of their transgression, awaiting final judgment. This image suggests that the consequence of transgression is a permanent awareness of guilt. Not annihilation, but an existence tortured by the memory of what was done. And this image applies to humanity as well. We carry the consciousness of our excesses. We know we are destroying the planet. We know we are developing dangerous technologies. We know we are building unjust systems, but we continue. Why? Because consciousness, once awakened, cannot be turned back. Because knowledge, once acquired, cannot be forgotten. And because we have not developed the moral mechanisms necessary to restrain our own impulses. Connecting Enoch to the present is not an exercise in fantasy. It's pattern recognition. Every human culture preserves narratives about a time when something was lost, when humanity crossed a boundary and could not return. Whether it's the biblical Eden, the Greek kingdom of Kronos, or the Confucian Golden Age, they all point to the same structure. There was innocence, then came knowledge, then balance was lost. And Enoch offers the most explicit version of this structure. He doesn't romanticize the past. He doesn't promise a return to innocence. He simply diagnoses humanity has knowledge that exceeds its wisdom. And that is dangerous. Relating this to technology is not alarmism. It's observation. Artificial intelligence is developing capabilities that its creators don't fully understand. Language models generate text without understanding meaning. Facial recognition systems operate without transparency. Recommendation algorithms shape behavior without ethical oversight. In each case, there is technical knowledge, how to build these systems, but there is a deficit of wisdom, when and why to build them. And there is growing resistance to imposing limits, because contemporary culture values innovation above all else. This valuing of innovation without consideration for consequences is exactly the pattern that Enoch describes. Power without ethics is the hallmark of the Watchers. They possessed celestial knowledge. They used it for seduction, manipulation, and personal gain. Not to elevate humanity, but to satisfy their own desires. And humanity, the recipient of this knowledge, reproduced the same pattern. They used metallurgy for weapons. They used astronomy for divination and control. They used medicine for witchcraft and manipulation. Knowledge, divorced from transcendent purpose, becomes a tool of domination, and the world becomes a battlefield. Unrestricted access to knowledge today means that any extremist group can learn to manufacture chemical weapons. Any hacker can take down critical infrastructure. Any resentful individual can spread hatred to millions. Knowledge has been democratized, but responsibility has not. And the institutions that should regulate this access, governments, universities, technology companies, are trapped in conflicts of interest or paralyzed by ideologies that treat any regulation as censorship. This impasse is contemporary, but the pattern is ancient. It is the pattern of Enoch. This part should tie the whole narrative together and provoke silent reflection. The Book of Enoch wasn't censored because it contained false information. It was censored because it contained too much truth. It revealed that humanity is fundamentally problematic, not because it is inherently evil, but because it possesses knowledge that exceeds its capacity to use it wisely. And this revelation is intolerable to any system that needs optimistic narratives about progress, development, and enlightenment. If humanity is fundamentally unbalanced, if consciousness is more dangerous than liberating, if knowledge brings more problems than solutions, then all modern promises of technological and scientific progress are called into question. But Enoch is not pessimistic. He is realistic. He does not deny the possibility of redemption, but he insists that redemption requires recognition of transgression, submission to limits, restoration of order. And this message is profoundly countercultural. Contemporary culture values autonomy, self-determination, breaking boundaries. Enoch suggests that this is precisely the attitude that leads to collapse, that limits are not oppression, but protection, that not all knowledge should be sought, that not every boundary should be crossed. The Book of Enoch ends with visions of judgment and renewal. The Watchers are punished. The giants are destroyed. Humanity is purified by the flood, but a remnant survives. Noah and his family preserve the human lineage, and the story begins again. But not as before. Post-flood humanity carries the memory of what happened. It carries the awareness that there are limits that should not be crossed. And this memory, preserved in narratives like Enoch, serves as a warning, not to generate paralyzing fear, but to cultivate wisdom, to remember that knowledge without ethics is destructive, that power without purpose is dangerous, that consciousness without love is empty. This is not an isolated myth, nor a theological fantasy created to impress future generations. The Book of Enoch functions as a symbolic record of civilizational memory. It speaks not only of supernatural events, but of recurring human patterns that transcend eras, cultures, and power systems. Its value lies not in the absolute literalness of the characters, but in the structure of the warning it preserves. A warning about the precise moment when knowledge advances faster than the wisdom necessary to sustain it. The narrative of Enoch describes a turning point, an abrupt leap in consciousness, a transfer of knowledge that was not accompanied by proportional moral maturity. Not because human beings were incapable of learning, but because learning is not the same as understanding. Knowledge expands power. Understanding expands responsibility. When these two processes become misaligned, the result is not enlightenment, but instability. This imbalance is the true core of the text. It's not the Watchers, It's not the giants. It's not the images that draw attention. It's the structural warning. Every civilization that receives or develops capabilities beyond its ethical maturity enters a danger zone. Collapse doesn't come from external punishment. It emerges internally as an inevitable consequence of choices made without limits. This message has always been dangerous because it shifts the focus from fear to conscience, because it removes the comfort of external guilt, because it affirms that humanity is not only a victim of superior forces, but an active agent of its own destiny. Texts like this do not strengthen institutional control. They strengthen individual discernment, and discernment is difficult to govern. That is why Enoch was marginalized, not because of proven historical error, but because of excessive lucidity. Because he does not reinforce automatic obedience. He demands continuous responsibility. He does not promise unconditional protection. He demands self-restraint. And these are demands that traverse religious, political, and cultural systems like a silent threat. Even so, the text survived. In fragments, in parallel traditions, in languages preserved outside the dominant centers. It survived because the described pattern never ceased to manifest itself. Whenever humankind reached a new technological level, the same cycle repeated itself. Rapid advancement, collective enthusiasm, a feeling of mastery, followed by crisis, collapse, or forced reorganization. The Book of Enoch doesn't just speak of the distant past. It describes a recurring pattern. It speaks of societies that learned to manipulate forces they didn't yet know how to control, of cultures that confused possibility with permission, of civilizations that crossed boundaries before understanding why they existed. The mistake wasn't crossing them. The mistake was crossing them without sufficient maturity to handle what lay on the other side. This warning becomes even more unsettling when applied to the present. Never before has humanity had so much power concentrated in so little time. Never before have we been able to alter biological, climatic, informational, and social systems with such speed. Never before have we had so much access, so much capacity for creation and destruction, without collective ethics having matured in the same proportion. Enoch's text seems to anticipate exactly this scenario. A world in which technology grows exponentially while wisdom grows slowly and in fragments. A world in which irreversible decisions are made based on efficiency, profit, or curiosity, and not on long-term responsibility. A world in which knowledge is no longer accompanied by reverence. And this is where the warning becomes definitive. Knowledge without wisdom does not illuminate. It amplifies everything that already exists, including destructive impulses. Power without limits does not protect. It exposes. The absence of ethical maturity does not prevent progress. It only ensures that it occurs in an unstable way. The Book of Enoch doesn't threaten mystical punishments. It describes structural consequences. Systems collapse when their capabilities exceed their internal constraints. Civilizations crumble when they know how to do more than they know how to contain. Imbalance is not an accident. It is a predictable outcome. That's why the text was unsettling, because it doesn't offer easy salvation. It doesn't transfer responsibility to heaven. It doesn't promise automatic intervention. It suggests something far more uncomfortable, that the future depends directly on the level of maturity we manage to develop before fully utilizing what we already master. Enoch was not preserved to frighten. He was preserved to remind us that every advance requires limits, that every capacity requires proportional wisdom, that every awakened consciousness carries a weight, and that ignoring this weight does not eliminate its consequences. The texts were censored. The warning remained. And today, more than at any other time in human history, it not only makes sense, it has become urgent. Because now, for the first time, the collapse described would not be local, nor partial, nor temporary. It would be total and irreversible. The Book of Enoch doesn't ask what we believe. It asks if we are ready.